My mother had misophonia, a condition where certain sounds infuriated or even pained her. That fact shaped the entire course of my childhood. From as early as I can remember, I knew that making noise could set her off. When I was 6, I learned not to even cry out loud. I had fallen and skinned my knee, and my wailing upset her so much that she shoved a dirty dish towel into my mouth to mute my sobs. It tasted of old soap and grease, making me gag. I remember her furious eyes boring into mine as she hissed that I'd better stop making that racket or I'd really have something to cry about. I was only a child, but I understood. Expressing pain was a punishable offense. That was how I was taught to suffer in silence. Nights were the worst. If I so much as snored in my sleep, I'd be jolted awake by a deafening blast of a horn inches from my ear. Mom took to creeping into my room with an air horn at the slightest hint of a snore. The first time it happened, I woke up screaming, heart slamming in my chest. She stood over my bed, calmly lowering the horn and said, "Now you'll remember not to do it again." She called it negative reinforcement to cure my bad behavior. I was 7 years old, shaking in fear, thanking her for helping me. For years, I tiptoed through life, literally and figuratively. But on my 9th birthday, Mom revealed a new system to enforce my silence. Instead of a toy or cake, she handed me a homemade report card with empty rows. "It's a quiet points chart," she announced. Over the previous weeks, I'd noticed sticky notes with numbers appearing on all our food. Now it made sense. "See, each food has a price in points," she explained. A slice of bread was 2 points, a cup of milk 5 points, a piece of chicken 10 points. You earn points by being quiet, especially at times you normally make noise. Not slamming the door, 2 points. Being silent in the shower, 3 points. Not snoring through the night, 8 points. Your silence has value, honey. I was just a 9-year-old girl who loved her mommy and desperately wanted to make her proud. I didn't grasp how insidious this system was. I just nodded and promised myself I'd be the quietest child ever. The next day, I put the quiet point system into action. I moved through our house like a ghost, easing open drawers so they wouldn't scrape, stepping on the parts of the floor I knew wouldn't creak, even taking extra care with the swish of the shower curtain. I even avoided flushing the toilet or running water in the sink, scared that even those everyday sounds might set her off. Every little action was calculated to be as noiseless as possible. I waited until I got to school to change out of my pajamas, because the rustle of clothing was too loud for Mom's comfort in the mornings. It was exhausting, but apparently my efforts pleased her. When I got home from school that afternoon, she handed me the report card with a big grin. In bright marker, she'd written plus 30 points and drawn little stars and smiley faces around it. "Wow," Mom exclaimed, pulling me into a rare hug. 30 points in one day. See what you can do when you put your mind to it. My heart swelled with fragile hope. If this was what it took to keep Mom happy, maybe I could finally be good enough. That evening, she told me I could spend some of my hard-earned points on dinner. The fridge became a bizarre menu. With 30 points, I could afford almost anything inside. I chose a small steak, 10 points, because it was my favorite and I thought it would feel like a celebration. Mom cooked the steak, but intentionally or not, she cooked it to the texture of shoe leather. The meat was so overdone I had to chew and chew and chew, each bite a Herculean effort to break down. We sat at the kitchen table with its pretty flowery tablecloth, and I chewed as quietly as humanly possible, conscious that any sound from my mouth might trigger her. 5 minutes passed and I was still working on the first bite, my jaw aching. Mom's gaze flicked to me, then to my plate. "What on earth are you doing?" she snapped, breaking the tense silence. I froze, realizing I'd stopped eating. I'm sorry," I whispered. The truth spilled out in a frightened babble. "It's just really tough and I can't chew it." Her face darkened. "A cow died for you today and you're wasting it," she said, voice low but boiling with anger. Before I could stammer an apology, her volume rose to a shout. "The least you can do is eat it. Put it back in your mouth. Now." Tears pricked my eyes. My stomach was turning from fear and the disgusting wad of meat I'd been gnawing, which I discreetly spat into a napkin moments before. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the napkin and forced the cold, slimy piece of steak back into my mouth. I nearly gagged. In my panic, a small, wet choking sound escaped my throat. That was all it took. The color drained from Mom's face, then surged back in a furious red. She slammed both fists down on the table, making the plates and glasses jump. "You disgraceful child," she screamed. I flinched so hard I bit my tongue. Everything happened in a blur. She snatched the Quiet Points report card from the fridge and held it to the open flame of the stove burner. I watched, helpless and horrified, as my painstakingly earned points turned to black ash. "You think this is a game?" Mom hissed, advancing on me. I stumbled back, my shoulders hitting the kitchen wall. She grabbed my right hand in a crushing grip. Before I could even process what was happening, she was dragging me toward the lit burner on the stove. The blue flame danced, and a wave of searing heat hit my face. I struggled, But she was fueled by rage and far stronger than me. She shoved my hand close to the fire, so close the heat pricked my skin with unbearable pain. I could feel the hairs on the back of my hand singeing. My instinct was to scream, to yank away, but I was petrified. The burning pain you feel, she said through her teeth, her face inches from mine, is only 20% of how I feel when you make noise. Remember that. She didn't actually thrust my hand into the flame. After a few terrifying seconds, she flung my arm back at me. I cradled my hand to my chest, gasping silently. Angry red patches were already blooming on my skin, but nothing was permanently burned. I'd gotten lucky, if you can call it that. I didn't make a single sound. I just stood there, shaking, tears streaming down my cheeks, swallowing every whimper that tried to escape. That night, I went to bed hungry. I cried quietly into my pillow, hot tears of hunger and hurt soaking the sheets. No matter how desperately I tried to be good, it felt like nothing would ever be enough. And the next day, and the next, I ate nothing. Because of that one slip, I was now in the negative on points, Mom said. I had to earn my way back up before I'd be allowed food again. She stuck to it, too. Over the next 3 days, I survived only on water and whatever crumbs I could sneak at school. By the third day, I was so weak I could barely see straight. It was in the middle of spelling class that my vision tunneled and everything went black. I had fainted right at my desk. I came to on the floor with classmates clustered around and my teacher panicking. The first thing my muddled brain did was panic that I'd gotten in trouble. I remember gasping out, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall so loud. Please don't starve me anymore," as the school nurse and teacher lifted me. They rushed me to the nurse's office. In a blur, I recall the nurse, the principal, and eventually our school guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, all hovering around me. Mrs. Henderson pressed a chocolate granola bar into my hand and urged me to eat. I devoured it, not even caring that I was practically gobbling and making noise. I must have looked half feral. When I finished, I broke down crying. Between ragged sobs, I spilled everything to Mrs. Henderson. The point system, the starvation, the way Mom punished any sound I made. Her face went pale with shock and grief. She didn't waste another second. She wrapped an arm around me protectively and called Child Protective Services right there. I remember her voice shaking with anger as she told the CPS operator, "I have a 9-year-old student here who's being abused and starved by her mother." She gave them our address, my name, my mother's name. I sat there trembling, simultaneously terrified that I'd just signed my own death warrant by tattling, and desperate for someone, anyone, to help me. CPS agents arrived within a couple of hours to interview me at school. They gently asked me to explain what had happened. With Mrs. Henderson holding my hand, I haltingly recounted the nightmare that was my life. How any noise I made sent Mom into a rage. How she devised a system where I literally had to earn food by not making a peep. How I was punished when I failed. I even showed them the faint marks on my hand from the stove incident, though by then they were almost gone. The nurse documented my low weight, my dehydration, the bruises from where Mom had gripped my wrist. For the first time, people believed me. I felt a tiny flicker of hope until Mom showed up. She swept into the principal's office where this meeting was happening and immediately pulled me into her arms. "Oh, thank God. Sweetie, are you okay?" "I was so worried," she cried, playing the role of distraught mother to a T. What followed still makes me feel sick when I think about it. My mother proceeded to lie with the most convincing ease. She told the CPS workers that I had a vivid imagination and a habit of telling wild stories. She admitted she had misophonia, that loud sounds were hard for her, but claimed she'd never hurt me over it, that I exaggerated normal discipline into abuse because I had behavioral issues. She produced fake medical records that she'd obviously prepared in advance, which documented that I had an eating disorder and psychological problems. She had even faked a therapist's letter stating I often refused to eat and then lied about being starved. I sat there, stunned and silent, as my mother wove a story in which I was a troubled, attention-seeking child and she was a heroic single parent at her wit's end. With every word, I watched the certainty in the CPS agent's eyes waver. They kept glancing between the concerned, articulate woman in front of them and the frail, quiet child me, who did admittedly sound crazy describing a quiet points chart for food. In the end, CPS couldn't find solid evidence to immediately remove me from the home. Mom had scrubbed away any physical proof. No chart on the fridge, no sticky notes, plenty of groceries in the kitchen. Against my trembling denials, she insisted the whole thing was a misunderstanding due to my condition. The CPS workers left with promises to investigate further and come back the next day. But meanwhile, I had to go back home with her. I cannot describe the dread I felt, climbing into my mother's car as the sun set that evening. The small spark of hope I'd felt earlier was extinguished. I was being dragged back into my prison, and I knew my captor was furious. The drive home was deadly quiet. I kept my eyes on my shoes and my body rigid, bracing for the eruption. Mom didn't say a word until we pulled into our driveway. Then, in a soft, chilling tone, she said, "You've made things very difficult for me. But don't worry. I have a solution. Inside, I discovered what she meant. On the kitchen table were a pair of bulky noise-canceling headphones and a little white noise machine. Your new therapist recommended these, Mom said, voice brimming with false cheer. My stomach dropped. What therapist? She answered before I could ask. Dr. Nichols says you need sound therapy for your sensory issues. Doctor's orders. I knew she was lying, but I was too scared to protest. She placed the headphones over my ears and clicked on the white noise machine. Immediately, a wall of hissing static filled my hearing, like the roar of an untuned TV. I flinched and tried to pull the headphones off, panicking at how suddenly deaf I was to the world. She snatched my hands away from the ear cups and thrust a piece of paper in front of my face. It looked official, with a letterhead and everything. Read it, she said coldly. I skimmed it. It was a doctor's note, a fake one, obviously, explaining that I had a sensory processing disorder and that I must wear noise-canceling headphones and be immersed in white noise for my treatment. The note basically sanctioned exactly what Mom wanted. My silence. If you don't follow the treatment, it's considered medical noncompliance, Mom said, tapping the paper. So unless you want to be labeled uncooperative by your little CPS friends, you'll keep those on. Understand. Tears of frustrated anger prickled at my eyes, but I nodded. Satisfied, she crumpled the paper and tossed it on the counter. From that moment on, whenever I was home, those headphones stayed clamped over my ears, drowning out all other sound. She even made me sleep with them on. My world was an endless hiss, day and night. If I tried to slip them off even for a minute of relief, she would swoop in within seconds, brandishing that doctor's note and a furious glare. I was effectively trapped in a cocoon of static. Every hour in that soundproofed bubble was disorienting and lonely. The headphones gave me constant headaches. Even when I occasionally got to take them off, my ears would ring painfully in the sudden silence. At school, at least, I was allowed to remove them. But I was so exhausted and mentally ragged that I drifted through the day like a zombie. Mom had preemptively told the school I had some condition, so teachers treated me like I was fragile and perhaps untrustworthy. Mom also began volunteering at my school several days a week. She'd pop up in the front office or the library, always keeping a friendly smile and a watchful eye. It felt like there was nowhere she wasn't lurking. My classmates, too, treated me like an oddity. Rumors went around that I was crazy or contagious. I was that girl. The one who never spoke, who wore big headphones at home, whose mom hovered around school. I ate lunch alone every day, isolated in a bubble of silence, even in a cafeteria full of laughing kids. I was spiraling into despair, but I hadn't completely given up. One afternoon in math class, Salvation tried to find me in an unlikely way. We had a substitute teacher, a young woman with short dark hair and keen eyes, who introduced herself as Miss CB. I noticed her studying me a few times during the lesson. There was something different about her gaze, like she wasn't buying the official story about me. During quiet work time, a wild idea popped into my head. With my heart in my throat, I started tapping a subtle pattern with my pencil on the desk, over and over. It was the Morse code pattern for SOS that my dad once taught me while watching an old war movie. At first, no one noticed. But then I saw Miss CB's head snap up from her book. She scanned the room, and her eyes landed on me. I kept my expression blank, still tapping softly. Her own hand, which had been writing on the board, started to tremble slightly. After class, as everyone else shuffled out, Miss CB quietly said, "Emily, could you stay a moment? I have a question about your homework." I felt a jolt of both hope and fear. I approached her desk, glancing at the door to make sure my mother wasn't hovering just yet. Miss CB took out a piece of paper and wrote on it, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She slid it to me. My eyes stung with tears as I nodded ever so slightly and pointed to the second question. Yes and yes. She flipped the paper over and wrote another note. "Is it your mom?" My breath caught. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, then met her gaze and gave one firm nod. She inhaled like she was studying herself, then scribbled one more message. "I'll get you out. Act normal." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just took the paper, pretending to read it like homework, and nodded again. Before we could continue, I heard a familiar voice in the hall, my mother's. She was talking to another parent, but I knew she'd be looking for me any second. Miss CB calmly raised her voice to a normal volume and said, "Thank you, Emily." That's all I needed. I left the room, heart pounding with cautious hope. That hope didn't last long. A couple days later, in art class, I found a folded note hidden beneath my watercolor palette. In neat handwriting it said, "I'm so sorry. Your mother came to my apartment. She knows I was trying to help you. She made threats. I can't involve myself further openly, but I'll keep working behind the scenes. Please hang on." I closed my eyes, fighting off despair. Mom had discovered my only ally and neutralized her within days. At home, of course, Mom was more controlling than ever. She somehow increased the dosage of my medication, likely slipping extra pills into my food when I wasn't looking, because I started feeling even groggier and more detached. She introduced what she called family therapy sessions with a certain Dr. Klaus, who came to our house every week. He was supposed to be a psychiatrist helping us, but it was all a sham. Mom would spend the sessions presenting him with edited audio recordings of me. In those fake tapes, I sounded like a monster, screaming, slamming doors, yelling that I hated her, things I'd never even dream of doing. I realized my mother had been secretly recording me at home and manipulating the audio to create a false narrative. Dr. Klaus ate it up completely. He'd nod and take notes about my defiance and anger issues. If I tried to protest, to say, I never did any of that, they would both look at me like I was crazy. You hear how she lies? Mom would say sadly, and Dr. Klaus would give me this disappointed stare. It was infuriating and terrifying all at once. Under Dr. Klaus's guidance, my medications were swapped out and increased. I was on a cocktail of sedatives and antipsychotics that left me in a constant fog. Combined with the endless white noise and the ever-present threat of punishment, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. My mother even installed cameras in my bedroom, supposedly for my safety, but really to monitor my every move. I couldn't even cry under my blanket at night without knowing she might be watching on a screen somewhere, ready to storm in if I sobbed out loud. Then came the soundproof closet. One evening, Mom led me down to our basement. In the corner was what looked like a homemade mini-cell, a small closet-like space with its interior walls and door covered in thick foam padding. A heavy deadbolt was installed on the outside. I felt a jolt of primal fear just looking at it. Dr. Klaus agrees you need a more intensive intervention, Mom said coolly. My knees nearly buckled. This is a safe space for you to work through your behaviors. We'll start with 2 hours. Before I could even beg or plead, she shoved me inside and slammed the padded door. The lock clicked, sealing me in utter darkness. I lost it. I pounded on the door, screaming until my throat was raw, but I couldn't even hear myself. In that padded darkness, even my own heartbeat sounded muffled and distant. It felt like I had ceased to exist. When Mom finally let me out, who knows how much later, it felt like an eternity. I was a wreck. I'd screamed myself hoarse and exhausted myself banging on the walls. I stumbled out, and she actually had the gall to smile and ask, "Feel better?" I collapsed on the floor, sobbing silently because I still had the headphones on and was afraid to break the quiet. That became the new routine, every evening a stint in the soundproof closet as therapy. 2 hours became 3, then 4. My sense of time and reality warped in that dark, silent hole. I started to genuinely fear that I might die in there and no one would ever know. During a particularly bad week, a fire drill at school nearly finished me off. The alarm klaxon suddenly went off in the middle of class, a loud, shrill ringing. It instantly sent my heart into overdrive. I hadn't heard such a loud sound in ages. It was like a physical blow. I remember gasping, trying to stand up from my desk to follow the evacuation, but my vision went white and I crumpled. I woke up in a hospital bed. The world was blissfully quiet. No headphones on me, just the normal low hum of hospital machinery and the distant sound of a paging system. I cracked my eyes open and saw a concerned face leaning over me. "Hello there," a woman said gently. "I'm Dr. Sarah. You gave us a scare." My mother was in the corner of the room, arms folded, looking more annoyed than worried. The moment she saw me awake, she rushed to my side and grabbed my hand. Thank goodness. You're okay," she simpered. I was still very groggy. The nurse said something about my blood tests showing a high level of tranquilizers. Dr. Sarah fixed my mother with a sharp look and said, "We found an unusual level of sedatives in her system." "Can you explain that?" My mother launched into another masterful lie. She feigned shock and then confessed that she suspected I had been hoarding my medication and must have taken a bunch at once in a self-harm attempt or to get attention. She even showed Dr. Sarah some of Dr. Klaus's notes about my supposed instability. I tried to speak up to tell the doctor that wasn't true, but I was so woozy and my speech was slurred. Dr. Sarah gently shushed me, probably thinking I was delirious. Under my mother's watchful eye, the hospital staff accepted her story. Within 24 hours, I was discharged back into her care. I felt completely defeated. If a collapse at school and evidence of drugging didn't blow this open, what would? Mom had an answer for everything. That night, Mom decided it was time to cut her losses. I suspect she realized that sooner or later, despite her manipulations, some authority might catch wise, or perhaps Miss CB was still out there quietly pushing. Whatever the case, she enacted her endgame. I was half asleep in bed, still weak from the drugs, when she strode in and roughly shook me. Before I could react, I felt cold steel around my wrists. She had handcuffed me. My eyes snapped open in alarm. "WH what?" "Get up," she hissed. Heart pounding, I obeyed. She grabbed a backpack from the floor, one I hadn't seen before, and practically dragged me out of my room and down the stairs. I was so disoriented, I didn't realize until the night air hit me that she was taking me outside. Parked in our driveway was her car, trunk open, 2 suitcases already inside. I started to cry, the realization dawning that she was going to make me disappear. Please, I begged. Please, I'll be good. She shoved me into the back seat of the car and slammed the door. The child locks were on. A muffled scream of despair tore from my throat as she got into the driver's seat and started the engine. I could just make out her eyes in the rearview mirror, cold, determined. We drove for hours. I was so sedated and scared that I drifted in and out, but whenever I surfaced, I saw unfamiliar highways, distant towns. Finally, as the sky was just starting to lighten, we pulled up to a set of tall gates topped with barbed wire. A sign on a stone pillar read, Peaceful Meadows Youth Rehabilitation Center. Rehabilitation Center. My heart sank. I'd heard of these kinds of places, bleak, secretive institutions where rich or desperate parents dumped their problem kids. Mom had once threatened to send me to one if I didn't shape up. Now here we were. She drove through the gate and parked. Almost immediately, 2 staff members, burly, expressionless, came to meet us. This her? One asked. My mother nodded and started speaking with them in low tones, using that saccharine concerned mom voice about how I needed serious help. I sat in the back seat, handcuffed, feeling like a prisoner transfer. They processed me like an inmate. My shoelaces, my backpack, even my hair tie were taken for safety. They noted my bruises and underweight frame impassively, as if it was nothing out of the ordinary. Within an hour, my mother had signed all the forms. I was officially admitted, and she just left. Without a hug, without a goodbye. I watched her car roll out through the gates and disappear, and I felt a mixture of terror and a twisted relief. At least in here, I thought, she can't hurt me anymore. But what was in here? I soon found out. Peaceful Meadows was not a therapeutic place. It was a warehouse for unwanted kids, just as I feared. The building was a drab concrete bunker. The kids inside shuffled around sedated, eyes dull, following rigid schedules for everything. We weren't allowed to speak freely. There were therapy sessions where any complaint we made was chalked up as a delusion or resistance. Punishments were swift, solitary confinement in tiny empty rooms, or in some cases physical restraint and injections to calm us down. After a week there, I felt my spirit cracking. Incredibly, I even missed home. At least there I had some semblance of familiarity. Here, I was just a number, patient number 246, drugged into compliance and left to stare at walls. I nearly lost hope completely in that place. With each medicated, silent day that passed, I grew more certain I would be trapped there forever, forgotten by everyone I'd ever known. But, unknown to me, outside people were fighting for me. Miss CB hadn't given up. Neither had Mrs. Henderson. And they weren't alone. About 2 weeks into my stay at Peaceful Meadows, I noticed a new face among the nurses. A woman maybe in her 30s, with kind eyes and a subtle air of determination. Unlike the other staff, she actually looked at us. Really looked. Something about her seemed familiar, but in my foggy mental state, I couldn't place it. One evening during the distribution of our pills, this new nurse approached me with a little paper cup of meds. She did the usual, checked under my tongue after I swallowed to ensure I wasn't hiding the pills. Satisfied, she gave a small nod. But as she took the cup back, she also slipped a tiny folded note into my hand. My eyes widened. I quickly palmed the note and gave no indication anything had happened. My heart thrashed with both excitement and fear. That night, under the thin blanket in my cell-like room, I carefully unwrapped the note. In small penciled letters it read, "We're still fighting for you. Stay strong. CB." Tears of relief spilled down my face in the dark. I must have read those words a dozen times, holding that paper like a precious lifeline. Someone out there knew I was trapped, and they were coming for me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had proof that I wasn't forgotten. Miss CB and whoever we was, they were still out there fighting. A few days later, just before dawn, I was jolted awake by an alarm unlike any I'd heard there before, an actual security alarm, wailing throughout the facility. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then came the pounding of heavy boots down the corridor and voices shouting, "Police! Everyone down!" My door, usually locked electronically, swung open. A woman in a nurse's uniform stood there, but not one of the regular staff. It was the kind-eyed nurse who'd given me the note. She had a ring of keys in one hand. "Come on," she whispered urgently, beckoning me out. I stumbled from bed, nearly tripping, my legs still wobbly from the drugs. Chaos reigned in the halls. Other kids were peering out of their rooms in confusion, some crying. Staff members were scrambling, some with their hands already zip-tied behind their backs by police. I saw 2 officers haul out the facility director, who was sputtering that there must be a mistake. Meanwhile, the kind nurse half-pulled, half-carried me through the mayhem. We burst out into the early morning light through a side door. A wave of police cars and flashing red and blue lights greeted us. Dozens of children were being led out, wrapped in blankets. I blinked in the brightness, disoriented. Over here, someone called. My heart nearly stopped, because I recognized the voice. Mrs. Henderson. She stood by an open van, waving the nurse and me over frantically. The nurse guided me across the lot, and suddenly I was enveloped in a fierce hug from one side and then another. Mrs. Henderson on one side, and on the other, a woman with short dark hair, Miss C.B. I collapsed into their arms, sobbing from sheer relief. For the first time in years, I truly felt safe. They bundled me into the van, and we sped away from that awful place. As we drove, they explained everything in rushed, excited tones. How Miss C.B., whose real name was Claire, had connected with Mrs. Henderson and a detective who specialized in child abuse cases. How they had uncovered that my mother had done this before, to a foster boy named Marcus 5 years earlier, who vanished into a similar treatment facility. They found Marcus, now a young adult, and his testimony helped blow the case open. They gathered evidence from my house too. When the police raided it, they found the burned remains of the Quiet Points chart in the trash, my mother's journal of lies, which she'd intended to use to continue faking my illnesses, and of course the soundproof closet in the basement. With all that evidence, they secured arrest warrants. That morning, simultaneously, the police had arrested my mother and Dr. Klaus, and stormed Peaceful Meadows to liberate the children and arrest the operators. It was over. I was free. In the days and weeks that followed, I felt like a bird learning to fly after a lifetime in a cage. I was placed with my Aunt Julie, my mother's estranged younger sister. She had been searching for me ever since Mom cut her off and sent me away, suspecting something wasn't right. Aunt Julie was nothing like my mother. She was warm, boisterous, and made it her mission to remind me every day that it was okay to make noise. For one, my aunt was loud in the most wonderful way. She sang while cooking, laughed loud and often, and never once told me to be quiet. In my second week living with her, I accidentally dropped a glass at dinner. It shattered on the floor, and I burst into tears, apologizing frantically as I braced for her anger. But Aunt Julie just chuckled and said, "Well, that woke up the house, huh?" Then hugged me and helped clean the mess. No yelling, no punishment. Just a joke and reassurance that accidents happen. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did both. Of course, years of conditioning didn't vanish overnight. For months, I still flinched at sudden sounds, or found myself walking on tiptoe out of habit. Sometimes I'd wake up from nightmares where I was back in that closet or back at Peaceful Meadows, and I'd have a full panic attack thinking the silence and darkness were real again. But slowly, surely, with real therapy and the unwavering patience of my new family, I began to heal. Even Ms. Rodriguez from CPS came by the house to see me. She apologized over and over for not uncovering the truth sooner. With tears in her eyes, she promised that my case would change how they handled things, that no child's pleas would be dismissed so easily again. It didn't erase what happened to me, but hearing that helped. My story would protect someone else. My mother and Dr. Klaus were charged with a slew of crimes. About a year after my rescue, I was called to testify against my mother in open court. As I took the stand and looked across the room at her, I felt my hands shaking. She appeared so much smaller than I remembered, sitting there in a prison jumpsuit, no longer in control. My heart was pounding, but I took a deep breath and began to speak. At first my voice trembled as I recounted some of the earliest memories, the dish towel, the air horn, but with each sentence I grew more confident. I told the court everything, the Quiet Point system, the starvation and the steak incident, the headphones and the hours locked in the closet. My mother broke her silence only once, letting out a loud scoff and shaking her head as if I were lying, but the judge immediately told her to be quiet. I realized then that here, my voice was the one with power. By the time I described the night she dragged me to Peaceful Meadows, my words were echoing in a courtroom so silent you could hear people breathing. I finally allowed myself to cry as I spoke about how terrified and alone I'd been. These tears weren't met with an air horn or a slap. They were met with sympathetic looks and the attentive ears of the jury. I finished my testimony looking straight at my mother. She tried to avoid my eyes, but I kept mine on her until I was excused from the stand. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury didn't need long to convict her on all counts: child abuse, false imprisonment, conspiracy, and more. The judge gave her 25 years in prison. Dr. Klaus got 30 for his part. Peaceful Meadows was shut down for good. Its operators and staff faced their own trials. I remember the last moment I saw my mother in the courtroom. She was being let out in handcuffs. She turned and glared at me with an expression that I think was meant to be remorseful or pleading, but all I saw was a pathetic person whose power over me was completely gone. I lifted my chin and met her eyes without fear until they took her away. Life moved on. I started at a new high school where nobody knew my past. With my aunts and therapists' help, I gradually learned how to be a regular teenager. I made friends who found it funny and charming that I was delighted by simple things like being allowed to hum a tune while doing homework or to tap my pencil on a desk during a test. They didn't know why those things were huge victories for me, but I did. I even joined the school choir, me, who once was afraid to even clear my throat loudly. I tried out for the debate team too. Every day, I grew more confident speaking up, voicing my opinions, making noise. The nightmares began to fade. The flinching stopped. I learned to trust adults again, to ask for help without fear of punishment, to exist loudly and proudly in a world that no longer demanded my silence. About a year after my rescue, I received a letter from Marcus, the boy who had been victimized by my mother years before. He was in college now, studying social work. He told me that my courage, tapping SOS in Morse code and enduring long enough for help to arrive, had inspired him to dedicate his life to helping others like us. He said I had broken the cycle that might have continued to trap kids in silence. I cried reading his letter, realizing that as helpless as I had felt, I had actually made a difference. Not all surprises were welcome, though. On the 5-year anniversary of the day I was freed from my mother, I got an unexpected letter from Mom. In it, she claimed to be getting therapy in prison and wrote, "I'm so proud of how strong you are. I hope you'll find it in your heart to visit me someday. I love you, my dearest daughter." I felt nothing but rage and pity as I read her hollow attempt at reconciliation. She didn't apologize or acknowledge the pain she caused. She only talked about herself. I shredded the letter after reading it. Maybe that seems cold, but I knew the woman behind those words too well. It was just another attempt to reel me back in, to absolve herself. I owed her nothing. She had taken enough of my life. I refused to give her another second. In fact, not long after, investigative reports proved what I'd suspected. My mother never even had misophonia. All those years, the extreme reactions, the condition that supposedly excused her abuse. It was a lie. Or at least an exaggeration twisted for her convenience. She had simply wanted control. It was a bitter revelation, but also freeing in its own way. I could let go of any lingering guilt that I had triggered her illness. She was fully responsible for what she did. On my 18th birthday, Aunt Julie threw me a party in our backyard. It was nothing fancy, just a barbecue with the people I love, but to me it was epic. As dusk fell, some friends from school brought out a cake and they all gathered around me, singing happy birthday at the top of their lungs. Their voices were loud and joyously off-key, and I found myself laughing and crying at the same time. I closed my eyes and let that beautiful, chaotic noise wash over me. In that moment, I could almost see my 6-year-old self crouched in a dark closet, terrified to make a sound. I wished I could reach back in time and tell that little girl, "Hold on. One day you'll sing. One day you'll be surrounded by people who love every noise you make." The thought brought a tear of joy to my eye. I had survived. I had found light on the other side of all that darkness. I was free.